keep within bounds the new moon of Abib. How do we do that? And what are the bounds? Going back to the diagram on the other side, remember, there are markers: the spring equinox, the fall equinox. And what that period marks is what we will refer to as the strengthening of the sun. That is the time when, in the northern hemisphere specifically, the vegetation starts to come back to life. Okay? Which is one of the reasons why they mentioned the green ears. But the focus should not just be the green ears, because guess what? Sometimes there may be famine in the land. If there's famine in the land and the land is not producing anything, how do we determine when the year begins? Well, Abba never intended for us to look at just the green that's being produced, that's being brought forth from the strengthening of the sun. His intention was always for us to look to the sun, the moon, and the stars. Not to worship them, but to utilize them as the clock he commanded them to be, period. It's just that simple. Man can alter what's happening here in regard to the vegetation, which is why you now have seedless fruit today. Man has learned how to alter the vegetation. There's absolutely nothing man can do to alter the movement of the sun, the moon, or the stars. Can't touch it. And Abba said it that way for a reason. But let's move on. So one of the things that we want to do, whenever you get to the ending of the year and the next new moon, if that new moon falls before the equinox, you now know, according to the word, we got to keep it within certain bounds. What's those bounds? Within what the scriptures refer to as the summer, or the time of the harvest. Okay? So you add a 13th month, and it's interesting when you get into the number 13, and when you talk about gematria, or the numeric value of the Hebrew language, which we talked about in previous broadcasts. Okay? See, the number 13 is a number which represents unity, right? So you add that 13th month because now the movement or the circuit of the moon has to be unified with the circuit of the sun to ensure that the holy days are kept in a certain parameter. Okay? That is very important. And a lot of times people don't look at it that way. But not to belabor that point, as was mentioned earlier, we have a teaching that goes into somewhat more detail as it refers to the sun, the moon, and the stars. You can find that on YouTube. Okay? So let's move on. We stopped at Exodus chapter, not Exodus chapter 16, Deuteronomy chapter 16. So, verse 1, once again, he says, observe the new moon of Abib and keep the Passover to Yahweh, your mighty one. For in the month of Abib, Yahweh, your mighty one, brought you out of Egypt by night. Okay? Now, that being said, we want to just add something. Okay? We want to go to Revelation chapter 13, which is Chazon. Revelation chapter 13, starting at verse 1. I just want to read through because there's a very important point we want to interject here before we go any further. All right? And I stood upon the sand of the sea and saw a beast rise up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his horns 10 crowns, and upon his heads the name of blasphemy. And the beast which I saw was like unto a leopard, and his feet were as the feet of a bear, and his mouth as the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as it were wounded to death, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world wondered after the beast. And they worshipped the dragon which gave power to the beast. And they worshiped the beast, saying, Who is like unto the beast, and who is able to make war with him? And there was given unto him a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies. And power was given unto him to continue 42 months. And he opened his mouth in blasphemy against Elohim, to blaspheme his name and his tabernacle and them that dwell in the heavens. And it was given unto him to make war with the saints and to overcome them. And power was given him over all kindreds and tongues and nations. And all that dwell upon the earth shall worship him, whose names are not written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If any man have an ear, let him hear. Emphasis on the fact that it says, the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. How does that factor into what we're talking about now? So let's go to Leviticus, which is Vayikra, chapter 23, verse 5. Now we get into the sacrifice. First we had the layout. And what the layout is, we're going to see that in a moment. The Sabbath. The layout is this, that what Abba has done, he has given humanity 7 days. 6 days humanity has been given to labor and do all his work. See? And that's what's going on through what we refer to as the 6th millennium. We are currently in that 6th millennium right now. That's why oftentimes when the scripture said the latter days, it's not talking about the latter days in a sense like an accumulative amount of days. It's talking about the latter days being the end of this week. You see? In the end of this week that I have allotted for humanity. So we're in the 6th millennium. We are awaiting the beginning of the 7th millennium. And the 7th millennium is what we refer to as the Sabbath. Okay? Now, 6 days shall you labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is the Sabbath of Yahweh, your mighty one. So this is the layout. That's the layout. So within this 6th millennium, Abba is operating, Abba is functioning according to a schedule. And what did he do? He showed us when certain events were going to take place according to his schedule. That's why he gave us the sacred appointments. So when we get to the Passover, right? In Leviticus chapter 23 and verse 5, it says, in the first new moon, on the 14th day of the new moon in the evening. Now remember, the 14th and the 15th days of the new moon phase are when the moon is going to be full, which is a marker to indicate I'm gonna do something. Okay? Keep that in mind. Again, in the first new moon, on the 14th day of the new moon, in the evening, is Yahweh's Passover. Right? Now, what we want to do, we want to make a comparison. Okay? And what is this comparison? We want to interject another thought. When we go back to Revelation, it speaks of the Lamb who was slain from the foundation of the world, right? Now, we're going to see exactly what that means, but my focal point and what we're about to get into is the Lamb. The focal point is the Lamb. So let's go to Bereshit, which is Genesis chapter 22, verses 7 and 8. Now, this particular portion is being taken from what we refer to as the Akedah, or the bonding, right? The bonding of Yitzhak, or Isaac, right? So Yitzhak spoke unto Abraham his father and said, my father? And he said, here I am, my son. And he said, behold the fire and the wood, but where is Hasheh? Right? Where is Hasheh? Now, if you look that word up, if you look in the Hebrew language, you'll see that the term translated as the Lamb is in the Hebrew, Hasheh. He said, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? But listen to Abraham's response. And Abraham said, my son Elohim will provide himself hasheh, or the lamb, for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together. Now, he who has an ear, let him hear. What this was clearly saying is that Isaac, in spite of the fact that I was commanded to go up to this mountain and offer you as a burnt offering, I already know, based on the promises that Yahweh Elohim made to me, he's going to provide something. He had faith that the Most High was going to intervene. And of course, for those who know the story, that's exactly what happened, right? But that's not the only point we want to look at, because this term here, hasheh, it appears twice, in verse 7 and in verse 8. But what's interesting, this is the first time that the term appears, hasheh. What is interesting is the very next time the term hasheh appears in Holy Scripture. So let's do that. Let's go to that next point. It says, Exodus, once again, chapter 12 and verse 3. It says, speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th day of this new moon, they shall take to them every man a lamb, according to their father's houses, a lamb for a household. Now, another point we want to interject right here, as we're going through this. Moshe is given very specific instructions to carry out for a reason. And I want to emphasize that, for a reason. Because today, when we observe Passover, we are not replicating what Moshe did. That's not what we're doing. We are simply obeying Abba's command through his word to remember what happened during the days of Moshe, which is why it is referred to as a memorial, which we're going to see. Okay? But let's go to Exodus 12:4 now. He says, and if the household is too little for a lamb, then he and his neighbor next to his house shall take one according to the number of the souls. According to what everyone can eat, you shall make your count for hasheh. Hasheh. So, we are introduced to the term hasheh in Genesis during the time of the Akedah, the binding of Isaac. The very next time the word hasheh is used in Holy Scripture, it's used for the Passover. So the question, Bible believers and Bible students, is the lamb that Yahweh Elohim will provide for himself this Passover lamb? Food for thought. Let's make another comparison. Let's go to Yeshaya, which is Isaiah chapter 53, and start at verse 1. Let's read right on through. Who has believed our report, and to whom is the arm of Yahweh revealed? For he shall grow up before him as a tender plant, and as a root out of a dry ground. He has no form, no comeliness, and when we shall see him, there is no beauty that we should desire him. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows. Yet we did esteem him stricken, smitten of Elohim, and afflicted. But he was wounded for our transgressions, bruised for our iniquities. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. That part right there, when you look at the condition of everybody today who considers themselves to be Hebrew or Israelite or Jew, listen to what it says. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way. Listen to that. Even when it pertains to the observance of the Passover. Some people already kept the Passover last month. Some people kept the Passover a day before we did. Why is it that we who's supposed to be the holders and the guardians of the truth are in such disarray? Even the Christians keep Easter all at the same time. Every Muslim, be it Sunni, be it Shiite, be it Nation of Islam, they keep Ramadan at the same time. But we claim to be the people of the book, and we are in disarray and cannot even observe the festivals at the same time. Our word is true. But let's keep going. Verse 6 again. Isaiah 53. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned everyone to his own way, and Yahweh hath laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. He is brought as a lamb to the slaughter. And as a sheep before his shearers is dumb, so he opened not his mouth. He was taken from prison and from judgment, and who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was stricken. And he made his grave with the wicked, and with the rich in his death, because he had done no violence, neither was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it pleased Yahweh to bruise him. He hath put him to grief, when you shall make his soul an offering for sin. He shall see his seed, he shall prolong his days, and the pleasure of Yahweh shall prosper in his hand. He shall see of the travail of his soul, and shall be satisfied. By his knowledge shall my righteous servant justify many, for he shall bear their iniquities. Therefore will I divide him a portion with the great, and he shall divide the spoil with the strong, because he has poured out his soul unto death, and he was numbered with the transgressors, and he bare the sin of many, and made intercession for the transgressors. Okay? Isaiah chapter 53. Those who are believers in Yahushua HaMashiach know that this is a prophecy about his sacrifice. Okay? Let's continue to build. One more passage. Yuchanan, chapter 1, verse 29 and 30, or John, if you will. The next day, Yuchanan sees Yahushua coming to him and said, Behold, the Lamb of Elohim, which takes away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, after me comes a man which is preferred before me, for he was before me. So now, when it comes to that lamb, that Passover lamb, right? We saw some examples, okay? We saw examples that Hashem, Abraham, he said that Yahweh Elohim will provide himself Hashem. The very next time we see Hashem is during the Passover, okay? So Holy Scripture is making connections for us, contextually, okay? Now, going back to Exodus chapter 5, let's pick up, Exodus chapter 12, verse 5, let's pick back up. He says, Your lamb shall be without defect, a male, a year old, which is one of the reasons why Yahushua had to keep the Torah perfectly. Have no blemishes, okay? You shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. It didn't just have to be a young sheep. It could have been a young goat. Why is that interjected? Okay? Food for thought. Just keep that in mind. We're going to revisit that later on when we touch on something else. Verse 6. And you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same new moon. And the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill. Now when it says it at evening, right? But when it says it at, what you'll find is this. In the Hebrew language, that word is, and you see that at the bottom here, 996, bain, which means between, right? Now what this does, it says, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill between the evenings. Kill that lamb between the evening. And what does that mean? Number one, what it's doing is specifying when a new day begins. Excuse me, because if the day begins at sunset, and we want to keep this in mind, sunset begins a day. So when the sunset from the 13th going into the 14th, now the first part of the 14th of Abib, which is Passover, happens during the evening. When we look at some of the accounts that took place with Yahushua HaMashiach, we're going to see there's a reason why it started into the evening, and it started in the evening and went into the day. That is, technically speaking, between the evenings. The evening of the 14th and the evening of the 15th. So between the evenings, these events took place. Again, what takes place with Yahushua HaMashiach is the only replication or duplication of what Moshe was commanded to do. We're going to see that as we go on. Okay? Not going to get into all that detail today, but as we go on throughout the plan of salvation, we're going to get to that, so that we can see clearly exactly what it is that Yahweh Elohim was doing. So that when it comes to the Passover, there should not be a discrepancy as to when we should hold the Seder. The Seder should be held on the evening of the 14th of Abib, not the evening of the 15th of Abib. Okay? Some people are going to take me to task for that, but I will willing, you'll be able to see clearly as we move a little further. Okay? So, again, it says between the evenings. Exodus 12:7. They shall take some of the blood and put it on the two doorposts and on the lintel, on the houses in which they shall eat it. They shall eat the meat this night, roasted with fire and unleavened bread. They shall eat it with bitter herbs. Now, when you get into the symbols for Passover, you have the lamb, you have the unleavened bread, and you have the bitter herb. Okay? Keep that in mind. Those are the three symbols for Passover. There is nothing in Holy Scripture to indicate that we should have an egg on the Seder plate. So the question we have to ask, because that is something that Judaism and Christianity share, that egg. It appears on the Seder plate, and it's now associated with Easter and the Easter egg hunts. And what's interesting even about that, rabbits don't lay eggs. You have a rabbit associated with Easter, and you have the egg associated with Easter. Why is that? Because Easter is the name of a fertility goddess. The rabbit being a symbol of fertility, the egg being a symbol of fertility, and guess who else gravitated to it? Judaism. That's why you have the egg on the Seder plate. Excuse me. Let's move on. So, verse 8. They shall eat the meat this night, roasted with fire and unleavened bread. They shall eat it with bitter herbs. Don't eat it raw, nor boil at all with water, but roast it with fire. So he's teaching us how we're supposed to prepare the lamb, with its head, its leg, and its inner parts. Now, of course, this specifically is referring to the sacrifice that's going to happen and what they're supposed to do when they're preparing that lamb. They're going to eat it after the fact, right? If we prepare lamb today for the Passover, it is being done by tradition or custom. Keep that in mind. And we're going to see what I mean as we move along. Verse 10. You shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, but that which remains of it until the morning you shall burn with fire. Once again, Moshe is being given very specific instructions for what he needs to do during this time. And I have to emphasize that. Years ago, came across a video of some people who live in one of the African countries. I do not remember which African country, so forgive me. But one of the things that they were teaching is that they were Israelites, right? And one of the points that they were making is that to prove that they were Israelites is that they kept the Passover. Now, when he explained what they do in regard to keeping the Passover, he went through the process of killing a lamb and putting the blood over the doorpost and over the lintel. We do not have to do that today. When they did that back then, they didn't have to keep putting blood on the doorpost after that one time, after they was let free from Egypt. They didn't have to keep doing that because the angel of death came through that time. That was for Moshe. And that was not to be replicated. And when I say replicated, I'm not even talking about replicated in the sense of putting blood on the doors in that sense. Not the physical blood anyway. But the steps that Moshe goes through were going to be duplicated by Yahushua HaMashiach in a spiritual form. Or a prophetic form, if you will. Okay? But we are not commanded to keep doing that every single year. One of the things that we talked about in regard to what law, right? There are passages that people like to go to that Brother Paul mentions that we're not under this law or that law, but the question we're supposed to ask is what law? And in some of those instances, what we found out, he's talking about the sacrificial system. We are no longer obligated to offer sacrifices. Why? Because Yahushua HaMashiach became that sacrifice when he became that Passover lamb. Okay, so keep these things in mind as we go along. Again, he says, verse 10, you shall let nothing of it remain until the morning, but that which remains of it until the morning you shall burn with fire. This is how you shall eat it. With your belt on your waist, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is Yahweh's Passover. One of the reasons why they didn't have to go through anything extensive to prepare, because when you go back to it, he said, with its head, its legs, and its inner part. You didn't cut it all up and take different things out. You just cleaned it off, and you roasted that lamb whole. This is what he's explaining here. You roasted that lamb whole because he knew you weren't going to have time to do everything else. Because shortly thereafter, and when all of this took place, remember, they killed it between the evening. So the lamb was killed on the 14th. As they were going into the 15th, which is one of the reasons why people keep the Seder on the 15th, which they need not do again. Moshe was told to do that. And when you look at what Yahushua HaMashiach did with his disciples, the question we have to ask, why did they observe the Passover Seder on the evening of the 14th? And people are going to say, well, he wasn't going to be there. The question again, was it necessary for him to be there if this is the way Abba intended for it to be done? He could have still did whatever he did and become that Passover lamb without having it early. And another question that one of the brothers asked when we were discussing this. Let's say, just for hypothetical sake, right? Let's say for the 33 years that Yahushua HaMashiach lived, he was keeping the Passover Seder on the eve of the 15th, right? Then the question would be, why switch it up this time? Because when you go to Holy Scripture, some people, not all, some people like to say, well, that wasn't even a Passover. They were just eating a meal. Hold up. If that's the case, why did he say, and we're going to read that in a moment, why did he say that he longed to keep this Passover with them? Did he not know that it wasn't Passover? That you're not supposed to keep it right now, you're supposed to keep it the next evening? This is just food for thought, okay? Food for thought. So again, verse 10, you shall let nothing of it remain until the morning,